Oh, my friends, we're living in the last days. We're living in the time of Matthew 24. If things get much worse, God's going to have to issue an apology to Sodom and Gomorrah. The Lord could return at any moment. I don't think things could get much worse. The Lord's return is nigh at hand. How many times have we heard sermons like this? Now, I'm not trying to ridicule, downplay, or make fun of such sermons, because these sermons are not coming out of a place of anger, hatred, fear-mongering, conspiracy theory. They're coming out of a place of deep, heartfelt concern for society, for the people, and for the world. And they're just looking at the prophecies of end times and seeing the things that are written of how things are going to be in the end, and seeing parallels in our modern day everyday life. So it appears that, yeah, Jesus is going to return at any moment. It could be any time. We are so close. We are living in the 11th hour. We are living in the last days. And so these ministers and preachers who are preaching such sermons are wanting people to wake up so that they can get their hearts and lives and minds right with God before Messiah does return, or before they die. So I totally get that, and I'm not downplaying that at all. And do I believe that we're living in the last days? Yes, I do. If you take that passage of Scripture, I believe it's in the Psalms, where it says that a day to the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as is a day. So God is infinite. His reference of time is totally different from our perspective, being created finite beings. And so a day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So do I believe that we're living in the last days? We're living in the last 1,000 years? Yeah, very likely so. A lot of times when people say we're living in the last days, they literally think that it's only a few years until Messiah returns. And it very well could be. I personally believe that there's still some key things that have to come to pass before the Messiah returns, and that's not what this vlog is about. This blog, this podcast is. So we're not going to touch on any of those things. But what I wanted to bring out to you is this message of the soon return of Messiah, and the despair that we're living in a very evil world, a very fallen world, a very corrupt world, a very hedonistic world, that we're living in the last days, where men shall be lovers of self more than lovers of God, and the love of many will grow cold, and their lawlessness will abound. In many generations that have gone before us have lived in such days and times themselves, and they themselves did believe that they were living in the last days, that they believed that Yeshua, that Jesus Christ was going to return within their lifetime. Let's go back to the Roaring 20s, the 1920s. It's where the women's liberation movement was just beginning, just starting. Women were wearing short skirts. They were taking on men's jobs. They were being very independent, very promiscuous, very worldly. You had they called them the flappers. Science was growing by leaps and bounds in the 1920s, and a lot of new discoveries were taking place. There was new political and philosophical worldviews and ways of thinking. Communism was beginning to take hold and take root, as well as socialism. And evolution in science was taking precedence over the Word of God. You had alcoholism. The years of the Prohibition that was about ready to start, and so alcoholism was a big thing. There was a lot of things going on. You were also experiencing an economic depression, and people were getting very desperate. So there was a lot of theft in order to survive, a lot of hunger, a lot of starvation. There was a lot of bad things going on in the 1920s. And so people of that day saw the worldliness of the 1920s. And a lot of this can be summarized and seen in the novel, The Great Gatsby, where it was so very selfish and very hedonistic. And it was party till you drop. And it was all about, if it feels good, do it. So the true remnant believers of the 1920s saw this happening, and they too believed that the return of Messiah was nigh, that it was going to happen within their lifetime. But what happened after the hedonism and decadence of the 1920s, the Roaring '20s? We actually seen a revival take place. We actually seen a turn within society, going back to the Judeo-Christian morals and values and standards that the Americas were founded upon. And so we've seen a great revival of the 1930s and 40s, and even a little bit into the 50s. And then it was into the 50s again, you started seeing that downward spiral of the people going back into hedonism, going back into, you had the communist scare, the Red Scare that was happening again. You had science, again, having another surge of growth, growing by leaps and bounds. And you had a lot of new philosophical worldviews and political stances that were taking place. So you kind of seen a repeat of the 1920s in the 50s, moving on into and climaxing in the 60s with the hippie, free love, make love not war movement, and all of the protests and all of the individuality and free spirit. And, you know, you had the trend of streaking and nude beaches, and you had a lot of Middle Eastern and mystical thought. Satanism came into vogue in the late 60s and climaxed in the early 70s, where Satanism was really prominent and really growing, and the movement was growing. So the same thing that happened in the 20s and early 30s, where we saw happen in the mid to late 50s, early 60s on into the early 70s. So those generations too saw what was happening in the 60s, saw the hedonism, the if it feels good, do it, the amorality, and the hedonism and the violence and the wars and the protests. And they were reading Matthew 24 and saying, yeah, we're living in that time, we're living in that day and age. And so the people of the 60s thought that the Messiah was going to return in their lifetime. They too felt that way. And so what did we see happen in the late 60s, early 70s taking place? We saw the Jesus People movement. We saw that this hedonistic hippie movement gave birth to a grassroots, genuine movement of the Jesus People. And that's when a lot of people, especially my generation and my age, we see as the golden age, the good old days of the church, where bus ministry was just thriving. They were busing in kids from the neighborhoods by the busloads. Like my church, we used to have a fleet of buses of, I think, 4 or 5 buses. And then once we hit the mid to late 80s, early 90s, we just had 1 bus, and we were lucky if we were able to put 20 kids on that bus. So it was in the late 60s, early 70s, on into maybe the early 80s, where we just saw this turn in the society, where things were starting to turn back to the Judeo-Christian values once again. We had a good presidency of the Reagan era that, was that kind of good old-fashioned, wholesome, kind of thing. So we were seeing a sort of a revival happening in the 70s, mid-70s, late 70s, and early 80s, when it was starting to kind of peter out at that time. So we've seen a move back to Christianity, back to Judeo-Christian values, and we were considered a Christian nation again. So we kind of see this ebb and flow, this up and down, this spike and valley of hedonism and things going very wrong and going very south and going very worldly, to the rise of back to morality and Judeo-Christian values and wholesomeness and spiritual revival taking place. And so, if you can kind of see that pattern with me, how that was going. So we move into the 90s, where the 90s was more of that apathetic type era again, where things started to get gothic and things started to get dark and things started to get satanic. And we moved into the age of the 2000s, where we get back into this place of amorality. We get kind of a repeat of the 60s of wars and rumors of wars and protests and civil unrest and political unrest. And we see disturbing trends that we haven't even seen back in the 20s and the 60s. Things such as transgenderism and transhumanism and the rise of AI and cybernetics and kind of linking that to a human consciousness and cloning. And we see political and philosophical and moral ideas that we have not seen in a long time, or at least in our lifetimes, because Solomon said there's nothing new under the sun. Whatever comes along that's new, it's happened again. And it also backs up that scripture that says that such is the time in the days of Noah, so it will be in the days of the Son of Man. So when we see a repeat of things that happened in Noah's day happening today, and we see that. We see the genetic manipulation that was happening back in Noah's day, because of Genesis 6, where it talks about the sons of God, the fallen angelic race coming down and cohabitating with human women and creating these Nephilim, these giants, these demigods, these fallen angel human hybrids. And we see these things happening today as far as genetics are concerned, where we're trying to mix animal DNA with human DNA, and we're seeing the possibility and rise of these mindless zombie viruses take place. And we see people going against what God has created and try to tweak it, where people are trying to change their genders and erase gender lines. And so there's another morality that's going on, where if it feels good, do it. And as long as I'm not hurting anybody else, then, I'm going to do what I want to do. And so morality is being thrown out the window, and morality is being redefined. Marriage is being redefined. Right and wrong is being redefined. We see in Isaiah, it says, woe to them who call good evil and evil good. They're calling abortion good and calling pro-life evil. And so we just see these things escalate and increase and cycle again and again. So there's people now that are seeing all this happen and seeing all this occur, and they're like, man, I can't see how the Lord can't return right now. He's definitely going to be returning in our lifetime. So I want to throw this out there for your consideration. Maybe we're in a time such as it was in the late 20s, early 30s, as it was in the late 60s, early 70s, maybe because we're seeing this hedonism and this amorality and this anti-Christian sentiment taking place, that we could possibly be on the verge of another revival, on another return to Judeo-Christian morality and values. We are ripe for that. Then again, Messiah could return. I could be wrong. But basically what I'm saying is, don't be a fearmonger. Don't be afraid. Don't be in despair. It's hard to see that there's anything good out in the world when all that we're seeing on social media and on the news is evil and bad and going against Judeo-Christian standards, and it's anti-Christian sentiments, and we're being ridiculed and made fun of across the board. And, we can't imagine much more evil taking place or taking form. So we're saying, how can not the Lord return, right? But as I said, maybe this is a sign that, the believers are going to rise up again, that there is going to be another grassroots, spirit-led, genuine movement of revival take place, just like it took place in the 30s, just like it took place in the late 60s, early 70s in the Jesus People movement. Maybe there's going to be a new Jesus People movement. It's going to be new because the Jesus people movement of the 60s and 70s was not the same as the revival of the late 20s, early 30s. So, and I think it says in Isaiah as well that God is doing a new thing. Can you see it? So this movement, people are pining for the good old days. They're wanting the good old days of the bus ministry of the 70s and the 80s, and the church is bursting and growing and busting at the seams during that time, and the revival that was taking place then. But we can't live in the past. We can't recreate the past. God is doing a new thing, as it says in Isaiah. So could it be? Could we possibly be on the cusp and on the verge of another revival taking place where the remnant and the believers will get sick and tired of being sick and tired and will rise up and return back to a true biblical based root and a grassroots movement like the Jesus people, similar to the Jesus people movement? Maybe we are on the verge of that revival again. Because still, you look back into, the 20s, the 1920s, all the way up till today, into 2000, like 100 years later, pretty much. We're still in the last day, because a day to the Lord is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is as a day. So we're still in that 1,000-year time frame. So yeah, we're in the last days. We may be even in the last day, singular. But that doesn't mean that Yeshua is going to return tomorrow. He could. But maybe not. I personally think that there's a lot more things that need to come to pass before that to happen. So this may not be the generation that we see Christ return. This may be the generation that we will see a revival like in the 30s and in the 70s. We might see a revival, because it was at the darkest time of the 60s and the Vietnam War and the hippie movement that a lot of the older generation said, this is it. It can't get much worse. People are dancing out there naked in the streets. But guess what? A revival happened. So people are seeing, all this transgender and transhumanism and all this, political unrest and wars and rumor of wars that's happening. And they're thinking, it's the end. Oh, the end is near. But maybe we're on the verge of a revival. Maybe revival is going to take place. I sure hope so. There are some who believe that there is going to be a last great revival before the return of the Lord. Maybe they're right. Maybe that's it. I'm not here to debate that, but all I'm here to do is to help you to understand and see the patterns of the last 100 years, from the 1920s all the way up into 2019. The pattern of decadence and hedonism and amorality and wars and rumor of wars and political and civil and economic unrest, and see how that cycle has repeated. And every time that cycle took place, a revival happened shortly after that, right on the heels of those times. So we're ready and ripe. If the pattern keeps repeating itself, we're ripe and ready for another revival. And, all we see is what's on the news and social media, and people are posting bad stuff because that's what gets attention. But you know what? For every bad thing that happens, how many good things happen that go unnoticed or unsaid or unreported? There's probably more good in the world than we want to believe and want to give credit for, right? So look for the good. Look for the good things and the good news and the good stuff that's happening. And cling to that. Don't get depressed and get sucked into fear, into fear-mongering, because that's what the enemy wants you to do. He wants you to believe that it's the end and that there's no hope. But when people thought that, boom, revival broke out. So hey, get prepared and get ready. Just stay close to the Lord, stay close to His Word, stay close to the Messiah, stay close to the remnant believers and fellowship, and get in a tight-knit community like that. And don't despair and don't give up. Hey, love you guys. Thanks so much for listening. Go out there and have a great day. God bless. Abraham'sDescendants.com. Getting back to the first century in a 21st century way. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to press the like button as well as the subscribe button if you haven't done so already, and the notification bell that'll let you know every time I make a new video. And don't forget to share this with a friend. Also, visit our website at Abraham'sDescendants.com. Thanks. Shalom. Thanks for watching. Stay connected by subscribing to our other social media accounts and visiting our website at Abraham'sDescendants.com.